Does theology school turn people who would go into ministry atheists? That is one claim by Britt Hartley. And I came across her video the other day. It's called How Theology School Turned Me into an Atheist. And her channel is called No Nonsense Spirituality. It's a 49-minute video. I have distilled that into about a 4.5-minute clip that I wanted to talk about today and show here in this video and respond to it. So it was an interesting listen. And so I don't do a lot of response reaction type videos, but she has a lot of followers, kind of interesting. So I thought I would go ahead and just do a response to that. And I want to be as charitable to Britt as I possibly can. I want to represent her well and give her the benefit of the doubt and be as charitable as I possibly can on every count. So what I want to do is just let her speak. I'm not going to answer everything she brings up in the video. Like I said, I've condensed it from 49 minutes to about 4.5 minutes. And so we're just going to listen to what she had to say and have some response to it. And then I want you to let me know what you think in the comments. If you like the video, then please like it. And let's just see what she says.
As you're studying the Bible, you start seeing how God changes based on how that society changes. So an easy example is like the concept of hell. In the Old Testament, we don't really have a concept of hell. We don't have moral distinctions in the afterlife.
So there's some truth here. I mean, you do see what Christians will call progressive revelation. And we do see some doctrines developed. For example, the Trinity is developed more, I think, in the New Testament. The question is, well, she said the notion of God changes. That really is a notion of God. It's more of a notion of the afterlife. Well, she said there's no split with the afterlife in terms of moral divergence of where people would go based on their moral life. I don't see this as a change in belief in God as much as this progressive revelation.
I had this thought that this was like the thread that started to pull the whole thing apart of what if we're the ones that create gods rather than God creating us?
So this is not a new idea. It comes from people like Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, who thought that we are really just projecting ourselves into, for the example of Feuerbach especially, we're projecting our psychological notion of all that is good about us to God, leaving all that's left to us being sinful and evil. And so this notion that we are in some way subjectively creating God is not new. I'm not saying she said it was new, but it's not new. And she did the same kind of things, for example, with Sigmund Freud, that, we just need a God and for some way. And so we tend to make it up, she says. Well, I think this ignores, I actually wrote a paper on this in my doctoral program in philosophy of religion about Freud and Feuerbach on this topic. And one of my critiques was that they don't look at the objective evidence for God. They simply say people wish this to happen. Well, they may wish it, but wishing God to exist doesn't mean he doesn't exist. So people wishing he doesn't exist doesn't mean he doesn't exist. And so Freud, for example, said we want basically this heavenly Linus blanket. And so we need God in this regard. When people like Paul Vitz, who, for example, responded to him in a book called The Faith of the Fatherless, says, well, Freud just doesn't want there to be a God. So this psychological back and forth about us wanting to have gods or creating gods, some people may want to believe there's a God for no other reason than they just want to, or they project it. That has no bearing on objective reality or any kind of objective truth claims. I do, though, think it ignores an interesting aspect of the origin of religion. In fact, I had to read this book for another doctoral class that I took on, in this particular aspect of the class, we looked at how religion came to be. And in this video, throughout this video, Britt seems to indicate there's this evolutionary view of religion, that religion kind of progresses along with us as humans. And so there are three major views, at least three major views, about the origin of religion. A typical one, until more recently, was the evolutionary view. The problem with that view is that scholars have realized that there's just not a lot of evidence for the evolutionary view. The evolutionary view is we start with something that's more primitive and more animistic, and goes through stages of, say, polytheism and then henotheism. There's multiple gods, but one main God. to monotheism. And there's just not a lot of evidence for that. So most scholars, from my understanding and research, have jettisoned that view of God for another view of God, which is a psychological view. And that's basically Freud and Feuerbach we just talked about, is that we are projecting this subjective notion of God out there. We have a psychological need for God. And so that's where we get the notion of God from. A lot of these scholars, though, either don't interact with, I haven't seen them interact with this view very much at all. And that is the view called original monotheism, which is written about by people like Andrew Lang and Wilhelm Schmidt. Now, Wilhelm Schmidt has a 12-volume series in German. If you don't read German or you don't want to read 12 volumes, no fear, nothing to fear, because we have a 1-volume English book. Have all those 12 volumes distilled down into one English book, and it is called The Origin and Growth of Religion, Facts and Theories, by Wilhelm Schmidt, translated by H.J. Rose. And we read this in my PhD course. It's a very well-documented work. If you have a hard time going to sleep, this is probably the one you want to read. Extremely well written. It's a great book. It's very anthropologically based, and it looks at tribes, especially in, if memory serves, Australia, and I want to say Africa. And his notion here is that no matter where you look in human history, you basically have everybody believing in some kind of a creator sky god. So even in the earliest days, in the most primitive, so-called primitive, and this is actually problematic, well, I'm going to go into why it's problematic, but these so-called these primitive groups all held to a supreme sky creator god, or at least the overwhelming majority of them. And this is called original monotheism. It's a great book, it really is. But if you want a more updated book and kind of a commentary on that book, this is one written by Wynne Cordwin. It's called In the Beginning, God, a fresh look at the case for original monotheism. So you really can't see that here in the camera. I'll leave links to these in the description. So I just think that that notion of evolutionary view of the origin of religion has just been debunked. And people nowadays in the academic world primarily look at the psychological view, which she's saying she thinks that she might have undergone this kind of wish thinking for God, or that we as a culture do. But she still talks about this evolutionary view a lot. And I think that we need to pay more attention to this original monotheism view. Let's keep on going.
The people writing these books are not people who were just like walking around with Jesus taking notes. These were stories that were passed around campfires for decades, and then someone wrote them down. The problem of evil, which is a really hard problem to solve. Why did God have to sacrifice himself in order to redeem his own creation when I can just forgive without any additional violence?
So a lot there. Her first claim, and I think she's talking about the Gospels from the context, is that the people who are writing down these books, the Gospels, and I guess you would include the epistles as well, she says were not there with Jesus. They were passed down decades later, written by people around campfires and whatever. Not exactly the most charitable, and I would say not the most accurate portrayal of how we got the New Testament. We do have a lot of eyewitness writers with Jesus who were there. For example, John, I realize that there's some contention here regarding the authorship of some of these books. Some we don't have contention. We have, for example, the undisputed works of Paul with the Gospels. Traditionally, if you look back at church fathers and the history of the church, Matthew was written by Matthew, Mark by Mark, Luke by Luke, and John by John. Now, Matthew and John are said to be disciples of Jesus. So if those are written by the people that we're told wrote them, then we do have eyewitnesses there who were with Jesus. Mark is historically understood to be the follower of Peter. And a really good book on this is Why Four Gospels by David Allen Black, not to be confused with Why Four Gospels by A.W. Pink. I'll leave this link in the description. I'll try to leave a link to all these books in the description. And this is a very short book, about the objective evidence, that is what we're told by church historians and church fathers about who wrote what book. There's a lot of contention about who wrote some of these books, and a lot of the contention arises from mostly internal subjective notions like style and grammar and vocabulary and that kind of thing. But if you look at the objective evidence, a lot of evidence that Matthew wrote his gospel and so forth. Now, Mark was not a companion of Jesus. He was a companion of Peter, from what we understand. So Mark really is more of a gospel according to Peter. Same thing with Luke. We're told in the prologue of Luke that he consulted eyewitnesses and he tried to get at the exact truth to compile things down in consecutive order. And we also know he was a companion of Paul. Now, Luke was a meticulous historian. Must be show and tell night. One book, for example, the book of Acts, which is written, this is the second volume of Luke, the book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history by Colin Hemmer. This is an amazing book. I need to get a better way of showing these books. Amazing book about the detail, the historical detail that only an eyewitness would know regarding what was written. So there's a lot of historical data to suggest that the people there were eyewitnesses. Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a great book to show that there was intimate detail in the writings of the Gospels that show that the people writing were eyewitnesses. What about Paul? We know that Paul wrote, some of his books are undisputed, like we have Romans, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, and these books, like Romans and 1 Corinthians, for example, were told in the mid-late 50s. Well, yeah, that's a couple of decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus, but that's not long in the grand scheme of ancient historical knowledge. And we have, for example, a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that most scholars agree go back even further than that book. So, because it is a formulaic way of expressing. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, Paul says that I am just giving to you what I received. And this is a formulaic way of expressing that. There was something passed down, not at a campfire, but passed down from people before Paul who gave him the accounts that happened. And Paul had his own account. And we're told in the book of Acts that Paul went to Jerusalem and conferred with the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, like Peter, James, and John, James being another eyewitness of the accounts. And they said that Paul was right on target. And lest someone say that these are just the New Testament writers saying this, we have the followers of Peter and Paul who are saying, yeah, Peter is on track, Paul is on track. We have both Peter and Paul saying that about each other. Now, I realize that the epistles of Peter are somewhat contentious, more so than, say, 1 Corinthians and Romans. We have lots of evidence that these people were actually eyewitnesses. Now, regarding the philosophy of the problem of evil here, I'm going to say this for the end because she makes a remark at the end that I think is really what her problem is. I'm going to say that till we get a little closer to the end.
But across the board, the main reasons for losing faith include, looking at the Bible with a critical lens, with a historical critical method lens, and realizing that the Bible has multiple authors and contradictions. It's culturally situated in a context. Going into the philosophy of religion, grappling with the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, which is like, if God is here, like where's God?
Let me before I go to the next piece here. So she's making a kind of a shotgun approach. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just hard to respond to. Because she doesn't give a lot of specifics. When I actually had tried to record this before, and I messed up in my recording of what I wanted to respond to. So this is take 3. And I realized it's been kind of difficult to respond to someone she says because she's not giving me very specific objections. She says, well, there's contradictions. Okay, well, she doesn't name any, so it's hard to respond to that. The Gospels have many, or the Bible has many writers. Yeah, there are 66 books if you look at just the Protestant Bible. They're historically situated. Well, every book is historically situated. I don't think these are reasons to reject it. Now, what she's going to say next, I think, is a good point to keep in mind, not just for atheists, but for Christians too. Let's hear what she says.
Alex O'Connor had a debate one time where he
Alice O'Connor.
asked someone, like, I've been, Alex O'Connor, like me, is an atheist. He started out more atheistic than I did. I kind of made that transition, but he also spent a lot of time in school studying God and theology and religion. And he asked someone he was in debate with, I've looked for God. I've lived like a Christian. I've read everything. I've prayed. I've fasted. I've studied. I read the poems. I read the mystics. I'm trying everything to be able to have some kind of experience with God, and nothing.
So this is an interesting point, because it seems like Alex, who's a well-known atheist now, Alex O'Connor, was trying to have some kind of experience. She didn't say what kind. Don't know if Alex does or not. And he seems to reject, according to this account, and maybe Alex wouldn't, I don't know, but according to this account, it seems like he rejected religion or Christianity because he didn't get some kind of experience. Now, people do this, not just atheists, but people who are Christians are trying to get some kind of experience. We see this with Mormonism, for example. They want to have the testimony and the burning of the bosom. Experience is a dangerous thing. I don't think that anyone should base the truth of Christianity or anything else on simply having a subjective experience.
And so the debater in response, like, epistemology, how do you know that your religion is true when everyone believes their ism is true? Like, then, something else must be going on here. Comparative religion, when you start realizing that Christianity is not unique when it comes to other religions. Virgin births are a dime a dozen.
She does mention here like comparative religions and epistemology. Yeah, I mean, everyone knows epistemology, and we do compare religions. That doesn't mean that anything is false, because there are other religions. She says, why is your ism true? Well, if she's an atheist, she practices atheism. Why would atheism be true if no one's ism can be true? Now, she talks about these different kinds of different religions. Let's have all the lists here I want to show you. I don't seem to have it. A couple I would refer you to. And again, it's difficult to respond to this because she's not giving specific examples of these dime a dozen virgin births. Now, I studied this over a decade ago. I looked up again in the response for this video. And when you look at the alleged other virgin birth accounts or the resurrection accounts and so forth, they just don't add up to being similar to the Christian faith. If you look at other virgin births, there are others who are allegedly said to be virgin births, but they really aren't. A lot of these are gods that are impregnating women. Perseus, his mother, Danae, was locked in a tower by her father Zeus, impregnated her by coming into her in the form of a shower of gold. Romulus and Remus, sons of the Vestal virgin Rhea Silvia. But their conception was through the god Mars, Alexander the Great. In later legends, some claimed he was conceived when Zeus, in serpent form, impregnated his mother. Horus. All these examples, they're really nothing like what we have in the Gospels. I wish you would give some examples, because it's hard to give specific responses to these generalized examples. It's easy to make these generalized examples. And I'm also not saying she couldn't give specifics, but it would be easier to respond to. But a couple of good books on this topic for these kinds of things. Ronald Nash's The Gospel and the Greeks, and another book called The Jesus Legend by Greg Boyd and Paul Rhodes Eddy. Okay, good books that talk about not just these mystery religions, but the Jesus legend also talks about. She mentioned these stories being passed down. The Jesus legend talks a lot about the nature of oral tradition, and that's a fascinating topic in and of itself, because of the ways that they did pass down oral tradition. These are largely illiterate people. Now, they had scribes, they had people who would write things down, but they also had mechanisms in place to safeguard the passing down of the oral tradition. So it wasn't like they were just making things up, and whoever said what had just reigned that day because they got to tell the story first. So there were people in place to be able to check the stories and correct them. Also, as Mike Licona says, we have what's called a Jerusalem factor here. A lot of what's going on, especially in the very, very early church, they were telling these accounts in Jerusalem and in the cities where these things happened. If you're going to make up a story about somebody who was killed and raised in Jerusalem, you're probably not going to go pass around in Jerusalem to people who were there, because they're going to correct you. So these these notions that these are just kind of given later and passed down just don't really hold water. And I don't think these mystery religions do either with these alleged virgin births and whatever else. Again, hard to respond to that because she doesn't give any specifics. I'm not sure the Bible does contain allegory and metaphor of all kinds. I mean, it's a huge book, or it's a collection of books, really. Got poetry is a main sections on poetry with the Psalms and Proverbs and all those books. They're very, very long. We have all kind of figures of speech. I'm guessing she's going to say that the creation account, maybe the flood account, the parting of the Red Sea, and whatever else, the resurrection, maybe we should be seen allegorically. Of course, that's debated, and Christians have not taken those. Some have taken, like Augustine, have taken things like the flood as allegorical, but not everyone. And you have to argue for that interpretation, not simply posit it or assert it.
And the Bible itself cannot all be true further. Like pastors know this. They've been trained to hold multiple interpretations, while at the same time training to dumb things down to protect the faith of their flock. And that often means withholding the very tools that seminary gave them. And so the great secret in my field is that all pastors talk to each other behind closed doors or in academic settings, or to each other differently than how they talk to their congregation.
So I have served as a pastor at 4 churches. I have been in the chaplain program with the Air Force for going on 20 years. I teach at a seminary, so I teach pastors. While there may be some pastors who no doubt do this, it's an astonishing claim that here she says all pastors do this. While I want to be charitable, and I really do, that is categorically false and difficult to believe that she is being very honest about this. I've never had an experience with a pastor or a chaplain or a student who wanted to dumb things down or had some kind of different language that we use behind closed doors. Now, that may be the case for her because of where she went to school, which I'm going to say something about here in a minute when she describes what her school was like. But this claim that all pastors do this is just plain false.
And so in seminaries behind closed doors, it's totally normal to go to school and for your teacher to say things like Genesis is clearly, a mythical origin story. And it's borrowing these Babylonian sources, or Isaiah is written by at least 3 different authors, or look at how these nativity accounts contradict each other. These are not just fringe claims. This is consensus among biblical scholars, even those who are believers.
Okay. So it's really no wonder, and this is not a jab at her or anybody else, but is it really surprising that if somebody goes to a very liberal school where it's not unusual or not surprising that your professors teach you that Genesis is a myth, they borrowed Babylonian stories, you have 3 Isaiahs, even though there's no documentation for that, this is all based on supposedly internal subjective takes on the writing of the book, not on any kind of manuscript evidence at all. That the birth narratives and other narratives, I guess, have these alleged contradictions. Is it really any surprise that someone would go to a school like that and lose their faith? I don't find that surprising at all.
Across the literature, what we're finding is that clergy and seminary that are trained in critical methods, source criticism, comparative religion, historical theology, it really starts to blow up faith.
Now, I will agree with that if you study these certain kinds of criticism, there's lots of criticisms, all kinds of different criticisms. I have one of my shelves over here. One of my shelves back here has a lot of books on that topic. If you study things like source criticism and form criticism and all that, you probably are going to blow your faith up because that erodes the text and it erodes your confidence in the reliability and the veracity of the text. The question is, are those the right ways to study the Bible? Now, she says this is a consensus among biblical scholars. That it probably is a consensus among liberal scholars, but if you mean all biblical scholars, again, that's just not the case at all. Now, there are evangelical scholars who do imbibe some of these critical methods, but not all of them. And it's not like if she means that the majority hold to it, I don't even know how to say majority holds to it, because there are lots of non-critical scholars that hold to the veracity of the text who don't imbibe these kinds of ways of going about the text. For example, I don't think you could get any more interesting of an example than this. You got Etta Linneman, who was a student of one of the most liberal New Testament quote unquote scholars that there was, Rudolf Bultmann. And she has a book called Is There a Synoptic Problem? Rethinking the Literary Dependence of the First Three Gospels. So there's lots of debates about, and she's arguing there's not a problem, by the way, that she thinks that we don't have these, that this kind of biblical criticism in the way that Britt's talking about is really more of imbibing a bias. Have we a little bit by her? Yeah. Historical criticism of the Bible, methodology, or ideology. Okay. So a lot of these scholars, because it's not a consensus, believe that there's a lot of these various ways of looking at biblical criticism really isn't a methodology per se, but it's a way of employing your ideology onto the text. A great book on this, but I'm going to show you some books tonight, is A History of the Synoptic Problem. That's the problem of the dependence or non-dependence of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels. The Canon of the Text, the Composition and the Interpretation of the Gospels by David Laird Dungan, who is a professor, at least at the writing of this book, at the University of Tennessee, I believe in Knoxville. And so this was an interesting book because, in fact, I had a PhD course on biblical criticism. We read this stuff. And he argues, along with Etta Linneman, that there's a lot of political reasons, a lot of even economic reasons, various reasons for imbibing these kinds of critical theories. So here's a book I want to show you what Ronald Nash a bit ago, The Gospel in the Greeks. So I don't really understand why she would say there's a consensus even if she means majority, because there are a lot of people who don't imbibe these critical methodologies. If she means a consensus among liberal scholars, sure, but then there's a consensus among conservative scholars who say no. So I want to be charitable, but it's just hard to go along with this notion that her claims are just in some cases false.
The more complex your apologetics gets, which I've studied some of the most complex, nuanced, internally consistent theological systems. The more complex that it gets, the more unethical it is.
What she means by that is, what she's trying to say is that if your apologetic gets more and more complex and difficult, you have to believe that only you understand the truth, and for everybody else, they don't get the truth. Which is ironic and I think self-defeating, because she's saying as an atheist, everyone else is wrong and atheism is true. It's hard to see how we're not having a self-defeating, a self-referential problem here with her claim, because she's saying, well, if you have to go to all these incredibly nuanced arguments, which isn't she trying to give nuanced arguments for atheism with all these biblical critical type arguments and all this kind of stuff? Well, why is atheism some kind of privileged position that you can be and not be unethical? But if you're going to try to be complicated and explain things, then all of a sudden you're being unethical.
Even if I give you that, you then have to believe in a God that for everybody else except you didn't do that. And so everybody else is confused except you.
She's purporting that everyone is confused except her, which is interesting. I think that's self-defeating. This is where I think she really has a problem. And I think this, in my opinion, it seems like this is what her real problem against Christianity is.
But even if you're right, like even if one of those emails actually did figure it out, they figured out the mysteries of the universe, they put together the right combination of biblical passages in order to really say, I think we've got it. Even if that were true, I'm going to give it to you that you're right and that's true. I wouldn't worship a God that created a system where billions of people are so confused and so superstitious and suffering for reasons that they don't understand, just so you could figure it out. That's unethical.
So
Like, that
she
sucks. Like,
seems,
I can't
and
possibly believe
it's a
that.
legitimate concern that she has here about, well, why would God create so many people if they're not going to turn to Him and then go to hell, whatever hell looks like? It'd be a horrible place to be. Why would God do that? To me, it seemed like this is where she really kind of opened up and said that, this notion of God that we see in Christianity is so unethical that even if He did exist, I wouldn't worship Him. So I think at the core of what she's saying, again, I'm trying to be charitable, but it seems like at the core, and she said this more than once, is the problem of evil. That if there is a God who exists, if He's a good God who's all knowing and all powerful, why does evil and suffering exist? Why do people suffer? And of course, there's lots of reasons to accept theism in the face of all that. One reason I would argue is that if we're talking about just the existence of God, I don't want to place God in the category of morality. Now Britt is, and a lot of Christians do, and I think they're wrong for this, is putting God in the category of moral beings like humans are in. There's two separate issues here. One is the existence of God. Can God exist in the face of all this evil? And the other is, well, why does God let this happen? I don't think we can put God in the category of moral. So to claim God is immoral or evil is to impose categories on Him that really, in my view, are reserved for creatures. Because for Him to be immoral means he's not measuring up to some standard of goodness. What would that be for a God? I just don't think God has that. So my overall thoughts about this, she only talks about liberals. She doesn't seem to really talk about, she references the fact that she says she has studied apologists and that kind of thing. It's like I've studied liberals as well, but she doesn't really, I don't know. She seems like she's saying there's a consensus among people, and all pastors in the back room are honest, and the congregation, they're trying to dumb things down so they don't wreck people's faith. Is there any wonder she lost her faith going to the school she went to who teaches that? She says it's just completely normal to go to school like that. Pastors simply don't have this language in the back room, as she says. I can't believe she said all pastors. That's just so easy to falsify. I don't know why she would say that. The evolutionary view of religion has just been displaced with the psychological view because the evolutionary has so many problems. Not enough evidence for it, evidence against it. Why is her position privileged and she's okay with saying atheism can be true, but for Christians, they are somehow elitist because they think they're the only ones who are right. And again, as I went through this, I thought it was somewhat difficult to give specific answers because there aren't really specific objections. She's giving categories of objections, like alleged contradictions and verse and verse being a dime a dozen. So let me know what you think of this in the comments. I'll leave a link to her video in the description as well. So if you like this, please give a like. Please let me know what you think about this. If you agree, disagree, just let me know what you think. Appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time.